Good evening, everyone. I'm Sue Vita, the Chief of the Music Division here at the Library of Congress, and I'm so delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture from Dr. Karen Bryan on Mary Cardwell Dawson and the National Negro Opera Company collection here at the Library of Congress. We were delighted when we got this collection because we could see so many things that we could do with it. Dr. Bryan's lecture is part of a special lecture series that the Music Division co-sponsors with the American Musicological Society, which is a national nonprofit organization whose mission is to expand understanding of music and sound through research, teaching, learning, and advocacy. Since the Society's founding in 1934, AMS members have traveled to the Library of Congress Music Division to research our expansive, diverse, and unique collections. In 2008, we got together and decided that we should establish this lecture series to highlight the valuable work of AMS scholars resulting from research in our collections. And after relying on virtual lectures for several years throughout the pandemic, we're really excited to see all of you sitting in your chairs and in person, and welcome them back to the Library of Congress for this season. I should also make a few notes before I introduce tonight's presenter. Tonight's lecture is the first of several local events happening in the next week, highlighting Mary Cardwell Dawson and her important story. So take note, this weekend at the Kennedy Center's Terrace Theater, the Washington National Opera is performing The Passion of Mary Cardwell Dawson, a play by Mark Twain award-winning playwright Sandra Seaton, with original music by Kennedy Center composer-in-residence and 2023 Grammy nominee Carlos Simon. Renowned mezzo-soprano Denise Graves stars in the production as Mary Cardwell Dawson herself and tells the story of Dawson preparing for the opera company's 1943 performance on a floating barge in Washington, D.C. Those of you who've been in Washington long enough will remember that barge in front of around the Watergate. You can actually see a photograph of the opera company performing on that very barge tonight in the table display that our music librarians have curated to accompany this evening's lecture, among many other fascinating items for the National Negro Opera Company collection. Many, many photographs, programs, correspondence, and more. So please take a look at the display before you leave. We'll leave it up so that you can see it when you leave. I know not everybody had a chance beforehand. So tonight we're grateful to hear from Dr. Karen Bryan about Mary Cardwell Dawson, a remarkable woman in the history of American opera performance, and to hear the important story behind her National Negro Opera Company. Dr. Bryan earned her PhD in musicology at Indiana University, and she was a Fulbright scholar. She has served as music executive at various institutions, including Arizona State University and the University of South Florida. Dr. Bryan is currently interim dean of the arts for Pima Community College in Tucson, Arizona. Her research focus has been opera of the 19th century, specifically the works and career of Saverio Mercadante, and more recently, Mary Cardwell Dawson and the National Negro Opera Company. She is co-editor with Naomi Andre and Eric Saylor of the book Blackness in Opera, which you'll find over there, a collection of essays from current scholars dealing with various issues of race and opera composition and performance. As a member of the board of directors of the Denise Graves Foundation, Dr. Bryan works with the education and historical initiatives of the organization. She's currently working to finish a study of Dawson's life and career and the impact of the National Negro Opera Company, which we will all be eager to see published in the near future. So Please join me in welcoming Dr. Karen Bryan to the podium for her presentation, Self-Determination on the Operatic Stage, Mary Cardwell Dawson and African American Performance in Washington, D.C. and New York City. Karen? Oh. I'm known for taking the other person's speech with me. That wouldn't be good.
Thank you, Susan, and good evening, everyone. First, I need to thank the Library of Congress and the American Musicological Society for making this evening possible. The staff here at the library have been amazing for years. I don't want to tell you how many years we've been working on this, but they're always amazing, and I need to thank especially Caitlin Miller and Kazim Abdullah for making this evening a lot more manageable and making it come together. And if Deborah does come in when the traffic gets here, I will introduce you to her. She is the grandniece of Madam Dawson. And on Sunday, she will be accepting posthumously the Joseph R. Biden Presidential Lifetime Achievement Award for Mary Cardwell Dawson. That will be awarded after the opera on Sunday. So we're quite excited about that. Finally, I need to clarify that tonight the terminology I use in this talk, including the terms Negro, colored, any other terms that I might need to use, are things that were used specifically by Madam Dawson about herself or about her company, and were used in the articles and mentions of her at the time. So I just wanted to let you know that. The last 4 years have been a remarkable period in the life of Mary Cardwell Dawson, and I've been researching her story now for at least 2 decades. While I feel I've come to know her as well as I can from the archives and from talking to her family and friends, I'm still humbled by the lack of public recognition for her and her accomplishments. But as we think about it, her absence from this historical narrative is not surprising, nor is it unique. When those of us researching in this area speak of pioneering African American opera singers, the response we receive inevitably involves questions about Marian Anderson or Paul Robeson or sometimes Todd Duncan. Until recently, there was little representation in the historical record of the achievements of literally thousands of individuals who were active in the years prior to Ms. Anderson's career, beginning as early as the mid-19th century. Opera in this country in the early 20th century was perceived as the domain of white performers and white audiences. Furthermore, European performers were considered more highly trained, more experienced, and more desirable for American stages. During the 1930s, the nationalistic and protectionist considerations benefited American-trained singers, as the newly founded American Guild of Musical Artists protected their income and treatment. These singers were almost exclusively white, and the Black singers, encouraged at times to audition for specific companies such as the Metropolitan Opera, were rejected for a variety of reasons, all of which had roots in the color of their skin. Citing lack of training, lack of experience, and discussions of fit, none of which were true, impresarios and managers would thank the singers and reject their candidacy. Meanwhile, they used these invitations to demonstrate their self-perceived openness and generosity to their audiences and their board members. Apart from sporadic hires for off-season performances of Aida, the most notable opportunities were in Gershwin's Porgy and Bess and in Virgil Thompson's Four Saints in 3 acts. In the face of this systemic exclusion, African American singers engaged in self-determination, creating training programs, companies, individual performances, and a support network to enable their artistic endeavors. In addition to specific performance opportunities, they lobbied exhaustively for recognition and respect in the operatic world, and to make opera a more frequent occurrence in the Black community. Professional and community activism in cities such as New York, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and Washington, D.C., led to opportunities for literally thousands of Black performers in the first half of the century. Important to this movement were opera companies focused on productions staffed by African American singers. Approximately 15 companies formed over these decades. Some were created to produce works by a single composer, because often that was the only way they could get them produced. So you have companies formed by men such as Harry Lawrence Freeman. Others, such as the American Colored Opera Company in the 1880s and the Theodore Drury Company at the turn of the century, performed traditional European repertory. While their performances were well attended, all had limited seasons and all were generally short-lived because they were rarely financially significant. The National Negro Opera Company, founded and directed by Mary Cardwell Dawson, emerged at a pivotal point in this history, staging its first performances in the early years of the long civil rights era. In many ways, the company aesthetic echoed that of its predecessors, performing standard repertory, especially works that included characters of color or that had been linked to Black identity in some way. Dawson was determined to present high-quality productions and to ensure that audiences were integrated and not restricted to segregated venues. At the same time, Dawson herself occupied a unique place in this history. Black opera companies were managed and directed by men, some of whom were Black. White companies, for the most part, were directed by men. Women, often aspiring opera performers themselves, had more traditionally managed groups built on the model of vaudeville and traveling opera troupes, all of which relied on a variety of entertainment in addition to the production of opera scenes. In Dawson's case, as a Black woman, she dealt not only with racism, but also with the attitudes of the men that she often hired to conduct. Most of the time, she did hire white conductors because of their reputation, either with the Metropolitan or other major companies, and she many times faced their not so subtle attempts to put her into the place they assigned her as a Black woman. Dawson's goal from the very beginning was to form an opera company devoted exclusively to full productions. She intended to take this company to every major city and to establish guilds that would become essential to the cultural life of those communities. She was not a composer or a recitalist. She was instead an educator and an activist. After earning her degree from the New England Conservatory in 1925, Madame Dawson returned to Pittsburgh and opened a neighborhood music school, the Cardwell Dawson School of Music. She had several models, but the one she followed most closely was that of the Washington Conservatory. Her school offered not only vocal and instrumental lessons, but also classes in music theory, music history, recitation, deportment, and church music. As the school grew, it was clear Madame Dawson had a more expansive vision than some of the other endeavors. From early in the 1930s, the school produced dramas with music, many on the level of light opera or operetta, and many times Madame Dawson would perform in those herself. These were popular productions, usually sold out, and were promoted through community clubs and churches. Also in the 1930s, Madame Dawson continued her interest in choral conducting, founding the Cardwell Dawson Choir. Membership in this group was by audition only, and they received many favorable reviews, performed in and won festivals and contests throughout the region, and performed at the New York World's Fair in 1939, in addition to appearing on a local radio broadcast in New York City that week. At the same time, Dawson was active in professional groups. In the early 1930s, she joined the National Association of Negro Musicians, an organization founded in 1919 here in Washington, and dedicated to the preservation, encouragement, and advocacy of all genres of music of Black Americans. She founded the Pittsburgh branch in 1932. Later in the decade, she served as the national coordinator of branches, and then she served as national president of the organization from 1940 to 1942. Everything Dawson did in the 1920s and 1930s led to the point in 1941 when, as president, she proposed to NAM that the culminating concert of their annual meeting, scheduled for Pittsburgh, should be a full-scale opera production. She argued that the association had effectively supported the work of a large variety of musicians, from composers and educators to soloists, choruses, and orchestras for over 2 decades. In her view, the organization was missing an essential opportunity to also support operatic composition and performance. It's easy to understand the organization's reluctance to engage on this scale. Expenses would increase exponentially, and the necessary performing resources were daunting. The performance would need to take place in a larger hall than associated with the other meetings, most of which were in public meeting halls, in the case of Pittsburgh Shinley High School, and would require preparation on an unprecedented scale beginning months prior to the performance. Madam Dawson was not daunted by the prospect of such a complex enterprise. In fact, situations like this seemed to inspire her and boost her determination to accomplish the seemingly impossible. She decided that the opera presented at the closing would be Aida. This opera's inclusion of characters of color, its subject of enslaved people making impossible choices, and its wide popularity in opera houses during these decades made it her logical choice. But the performing forces needed were formidable. Musicians came from across the country, having rehearsed locally for several months, and they actually opened on the road in Chicago in July as a sort of test run. Dawson auditioned soloists and made numerous trips to speak to groups about the opera. She started locally, drawing on her own chorus, the faculty and students of her school, and the members of various performing organizations and church choirs in the area. In the months prior to the meeting, she also reached out to other branches and performing organizations across the country, calling on their members to participate. Cooperating groups listed in the program included the NYA Chorus from Chicago, the Forbes Music Study Club of Cleveland, the Helen Carter Moses Singers of Columbus, of course the Cardwell Dawson Choir of Pittsburgh, the Detroit Negro Opera Company, the Imperial Opera Company of Chicago, and individual members from Texas, Florida, New York, Indianapolis, and Georgia. Here you see the cast shot during this performance at Syria Mosque in 1941, and you can see that indeed it was a fairly large cast. La Julia Ray was in the lead role, and she was a prominent soprano in the Chicago area. She had performed with the Major Bowes Traveling Vaudeville Group, and she had sung with the Chicago Civic Opera in one of those summer performances of Aida in approximately 1937. Frederick Vida was the conductor. He had been with the Metropolitan Opera and had agreed to lead this performance. He would have a multi-year relationship with the company, but he consistently argued with her, and he undermined her with other conductors and with singers, feeling he could do it better, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. Despite the success of this performance at the Syria Mosque, Dawson found little support to continue this initiative within NAM. She decided instead to form an independent company with the goal of producing operas nationally, but particularly in Pittsburgh, Chicago, Washington, New York, and other northeastern cities in which she had the greatest contacts and resources. She planned to be based in Pittsburgh since that was home. This would allow her to also continue her activities as an educator and as a manager, because by this time, she was a rather successful manager bringing solo artists to Pittsburgh for recitals and for performances with various groups. Her mission was clear, and she made this mission and vision part of almost every program she ever published: to offer opportunity to the Negro musicians in the field of grand opera, to develop highest professional standards in all fields of higher art, to establish the proper appreciation and cultural background that opera offers, and to inspire composers of both races, particularly the Negro composer, to create more interesting composition in the operatic field using the background of Negro folk tunes. Her philosophy is directly in line with that of self-determination, arguing not for inclusion, but for education, awareness, excellence, and above all, respect. She aligned herself with one of the more prominent ideas concerning music in the Harlem Renaissance and earlier, in calling for composers to use Negro folk tunes as the basis for new compositions, ostensibly for performance by Black ensembles. Throughout her career, she consistently sought to educate, whether in training members of her company in the music and musical techniques, stage deportment, or languages, or members of the audience that she wished to gain exposure to examples, as she calls it, of higher art. Her broader philosophy complemented her educational philosophy, emphasizing that the appreciation of and support for opera must begin in institutions of higher education, community schools, and performing arts organizations. She knew the success of choirs such as hers and those led by Ava Jesse and Hall Johnson, the importance of the community music schools, and the potential of the universities. We also cannot forget the church music programs, which she saw as the most direct way to bring all people together, erasing differences of opinion in the spirituality of the music. Once more, I quote, "It is the hope and dream of all races to attain the highest level in musical expression and culture. The National Negro Opera Movement seeks, through organized efforts, to further the realization of the dreams of our racial group. It is our hope to see and to aid the promotion of movements which will lead ultimately to more serious creative efforts in the field of orchestral and operatic music. Believing such movements must stem largely from basic educational efforts and programs, we hope to see our many universities and music schools initiate projects which will lead to the establishment of operatic groups and Negro orchestras of symphonic proportions in many music centers." End quote. For the opera company, she has a simple mission: to build a stage for artists of color in every city and town. No big ambition there, right? She envisioned a foundation comprised of guilds that would not only support the traveling productions, but generate educational and performance opportunities on a local level. It is also based in the realization, to her credit, that while she wished to control the artistic excellence and direction of this company, she could not do it alone. In her words, "The National Negro Opera Company, Incorporated, hopes to organize guilds which will welcome anyone desiring a more active participation in the work of the association. The Opera Company is founded to bring lovers of grand opera into close comradeship, to broaden the appreciation of the opera and allied arts, and to assure the performance of opera by the Negro artist in every city," end quote. Finally, she included a plea for funds, inviting direct comparison to white organizations and asserting the company's legitimacy on an equal footing with them. Again, she was not seeking inclusion. She was seeking equality, recognition, and respect. Her plea appealed to a sense of community, an element she knew was essential to the success of any artistic endeavor. And then quoting from her appeal, "If you read our daily papers or listen to your radio, you know that all of the major opera companies solicit annual contributions from music lovers for their maintenance." We've never seen that, have we? No. "Likewise, the National Negro Opera Company, Incorporated, is asking its friends to help bring the public such performances as this, which has caused great music critics to give worthy appraisal and acknowledgement to its efforts. After having been thrilled by listening to this grand performance, we feel that you can and will contribute to this worthy effort, united effort for cultural freedom. In return, we will reap the reward of strengthened morale and spiritual uplift. In times like these, it is more important than ever for the spirit of good music to be kept alive. Therefore, we ask that you earnestly give financial support to the National Negro Opera Company, Incorporated," end quote. Through all her writings, of which this is one of the most public, the recurring themes are spirituality, enhanced morale, and community involvement. She often ended her letters and public communications with variants of the statement, "Music maintains morale, music must go on," emphasizing the role of faith, education, and responsibility to the race and the community in her everyday life. As I mentioned previously, Dawson planned to remain in Pittsburgh indefinitely. It was home. Her family was there and often needed her assistance. And you should read the letters to her brother. Anyway, and she had an established network of support, both through the school and community organizations such as churches and women's clubs. A Pittsburgh headquarters would allow her to more easily travel between Detroit, Cleveland, Columbus, and Chicago, and for moving in the other direction to Philadelphia, Washington, and New York City. Her plans had to adapt, however, at the beginning of 1942. Walter Dawson, her husband, who she called Bob, and forgive me if I start calling him Bob because that's what I think of him, was a master electrician. He was employed by the city of Pittsburgh. When denied membership in the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers because of his race, he formed a splinter union for black membership. Ultimately, he was blacklisted, lost his job with the city, and was unable to find other employment in the area. With the start of the war, he moved to Washington and found a job with the General Services Administration. His is also a story of activism that we'll need to leave for another time, but it's one of my favorite stories. So if anybody wants to ask a question later, just saying. But he was ultimately recognized by the NAACP for his fight against segregation in the federal workplace. But in the short term, his move to Washington meant that Mary and the opera company moved as well. A Washington hub gave her access to many active singers who had participated both in the Pittsburgh and Chicago performances. There was a significant musical network on which she could rely, including one of her best friends, Camille Nickerson. She would also have access to venues that allowed integrated audience seating, a non-negotiable requirement for her productions. The proximity to New York was a boost as well. She could draw them on more performers, as well as expanding the company's reach into that city. And she began to establish guilds in each of her target cities to strengthen both the administrative and performative sides of the company. She introduced her group to the community in a mass meeting in February 1943, almost exactly 80 years ago. Dawson demonstrated the backing of community leaders and outlined the company's accomplishments and goals. While Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune was unable to attend as she had planned, she drew on many well-known individuals to lend their support. Performers included Camille Nickerson, O.D. Meeks, Ruth Robinson Logan, and the church choir of the Johnson Wesley AME Zion Church. Ralph Matthews, managing editor of the Washington Afro-American, spoke, and Alfred H. Johnson, music supervisor for the public schools, and Levia Friedberg, representing the National Artists Bureau out of New York City, also appeared in support of her venture. The culmination of the meeting, of course, was Madame Dawson's address, in which she gave a history of the company and its successes in the other cities. Many of these individuals would be integral to the success of the company in Washington. It was critical to have the support of Ralph Matthews. The Afro-American had already printed favorable reports of the Pittsburgh and Chicago performances and continued to publish reviews, announcements, and editorial essays over the years. His support opened a number of doors for Dawson and the company in social, business, and artistic circles. Camille Nickerson, composer, pianist, and professor at Howard University, was an unwavering supporter of the company and worked closely with Dawson, particularly in these early years, to ensure its success in the new city. This meeting also demonstrated Dawson's, and by extension, the company's, close reliance on the church community and on the talent found there. Mass meetings would be a key element of fundraising efforts in the later festivals. These were generally held in the churches, particularly the Metropolitan Baptist Church, of which she was a member. Dawson also sought and relied on support from the pulpit, announcing performances and fund drives. Finally, recitals and concerts designed to generate operating capital often took place in churches such as the Metropolitan, John Wesley, and in New York, the Abyssinian Baptist Church. After this initial meeting, it appeared that the National Negro Company was going to achieve its goal of a regular and sustained season with performances in its 4 target cities. She built the season on Verdi's La Traviata, and she hired Lillian Avanti to sing the lead. This was the first time that Madame Avanti had performed this role in the United States, even though she had starred in European productions in the past. The first performance took place at the Watergate Floating Stage in August 1943, and in Chicago the following October. The production then moved to the Syria Mosque in Pittsburgh in January of '44, and to New York in Madison Square Garden in March of that year. She then planned an ambitious 3-opera series for the Watergate in late July. The venue met all her requirements: integrated seating, a capacity for overflow crowds and free seating, and a reasonable rental price. She scheduled La Traviata and Aida and added Faust to the playbill. The singers included Lillian Avanti, William Franklin, and Joseph Lipscomb, and marketing generated excitement for the coming performances. But there were just 2 problems, however: the weather and the union. To say the weather was inclement was an understatement, and we're going to back up just a little bit here to that photo. It's best if it doesn't rain when a company is planning performances in an outdoor venue on the banks of a major navigable river. And being July in Washington, it rained and rained and rained. Aida and La Traviata were canceled. The weather relented a bit for the performance of Faust so that it at least started, but that's where the union became an issue. The American Guild of Musical Artists, and I'll go ahead and get back to Madame Avanti and the cast here. The American Guild of Musical Artists was a relatively young organization, founded in 1936 by Lawrence Tibbett and Yasha Heifetz to protect solo artists, opera singers, opera choruses from abusive practices of managers and companies. They also covered traveling groups with the intent of ensuring that performers would not be abandoned or stranded far from home in cases of financial disaster, because that happened rather frequently. By the 1940s, they covered opera singers, choristers, and companies, as well as ballet companies. Up until early 1944, AGMA had absolutely no interest in Dawson or the National Negro Opera Company, or for that matter, any other black opera company that operated outside of New York City. Or frankly, to be honest, a lot of the companies that operated out of New York City, or outside of New York City. They viewed the NNOC at best as a regional amateur group, but Madame Dawson's ambitions included New York City performances. It was a talent-rich environment and a large potential market. She intended to situate her company in direct competition with the multiple traditionally white companies in the city. With the performance of La Traviata at the Madison Square Garden, the company broke into that market. Now, this venue, which met her requirement of integrated audiences, was not without its challenges. The Garden is great for sporting events. It's great for dog shows. It's not so great for opera. The management required that she allowed vendors and hawkers to sell concessions in the stands during the performance, not at intermission. And the lights would not go down. Now, that's more like Italian opera houses, but that's another story. But this allowed her more direct access to New York artists, most of whom were or had been members of AGMA. Thus, we now find Minto Cato, who you see here after a performance in Aida. She was a mezzo-soprano from Little Rock, Arkansas, who studied at the Washington Conservatory. She taught school in Detroit and in Georgia, and performed extensively in Chicago. In addition to performing with Louis Armstrong, appearing in some of the Blackbird revues, and in Showboat, and acting for a while as a vaudeville manager, she performed several operas beginning in the late 1930s in various cities. Edward Boatner sang the role of the Baron. Boatner left teaching positions in Texas in the late 1930s and established a vocal studio in New York City. He was also a composer, with many spiritual arrangements and an unpublished opera to his credit. And he taught many opera singers and entertainers in the coming year, including George Shirley, Robert Guillaume, and Clifton Webb. Wilson Woodbeck, baritone, was also part of the cast, a former red cap for various transportation lines. And I'll give you there's some more of Minto Cato. He was a red cap for various transportation lines and had begun giving recitals after studying privately and at Juilliard during the late 1930s and early 1940s. He was well received as a soloist, receiving a review in the New York Times in early 1942, and he sang the role of the Marquis in this production. When contacted by the union, she declared her intention to work with them. After all, union membership was somewhat of a family tradition. It was also, in her view, yet another marker of legitimacy in the operatic world. She signed a basic agreement and proceeded to present La Traviata at the Garden. She also moved forward with her plans for Washington. The New York production, while artistically successful, was less so financially. She focused first on paying the orchestral musicians and the trade unions because those unions were, those unions were much stronger, and they insisted on being paid first, so she had no choice. They overrode AGMA in this case. It also meant then that the singers were not paid in full. So she started with the major soloist, but that meant that those in minor roles and the chorus were largely unpaid. She was warned by the union and was given an extension allowing her to proceed with the Washington plans. With the failure of the July performances, the union moved to restrict her activities. They sent representatives to hold performances until box office receipts were confiscated. Voluminous correspondence and board meeting discussions are devoted to trying to reach some sort of understanding. The union was adamant, perhaps more so than many other companies, and Dawson was just as adamant that the board accord the NNOC the same waivers and considerations as white companies, and that they considered that this was a new endeavor and one that was taking a great deal of time to get underway, and one in which the black performers had not been allowed membership in the union prior to that. So she was trying to get that established as well. At a hearing in early September of 1944, after heated exchanges between Madam Dawson and members of the board, AGMA placed Dawson and the National Negro Opera Company on the unfair list, meaning that she could not produce an opera until all obligations to union members were met and a plan for future performances was approved. Now, some of these restrictions, like sending a representative to confiscate box office receipts, I saw lots of notices of people being on the unfair list. I never saw it where they would go and actually confiscate the box office so that they had absolutely no hope of making any progress. Also, unfair list was not unusual, but the plan for future performances being approved was. And so there was obviously a distinct difference in treatment. At this point, failure was a distinct possibility. This was a company that should have failed from the outset. That initial production in August of 1941 could easily have been a one-off, a solitary performance that went no further. Obviously, she had a different idea, and it was clear that she had intentions of taking the opera productions farther than this one evening. By having an out-of-town preview for Chicago audiences in July of 41, and a repeat performance for Pittsburgh audiences in October of that year, she was declaring her intention to create a group that could perform these works on a regular basis in different cities. The company should have failed simply because of its timing. Late 1941 and early 1942 was something of a perfect storm for an endeavor such as this. As the U.S. involvement in the war increased, individual contributions would be limited. Walter's need to relocate to find work placed a strain on the family's personal finances and on the company's finances, because he had always not only worked a full-time job, he also had a shop as an electrical repairman, and every dime that he made that did not go to their living expenses went to the opera company. As simple as that. Failure was a distinct possibility in 1944 when the Watergate performances were disrupted. She had engaged all of the musicians and techs, all covered by union contracts. She had paid deposits for the venue and all the necessities, including rental chairs for the audience. She also faced a high demand for ticket refunds. Despite advertisements in which she asked people to hold on to their tickets to be redeemed for future productions, and the fact that one of the performances did kind of take place eventually, people wanted their money. And as she complained to her niece, Barbara Edwards Lee, they would drive up in their fur coats and demand the very coat off her back. She was hurt by these requests, seeing them as a lack of support and a lack of faith in the movement and her efforts to make dreams a reality. Again, we see this was a very personal mission tied up to so much more than the music. Madam Dawson never even acknowledged the possibility of defeat. The fallout from the unfair list extended far beyond mere money. Singers complained to the press and tried to persuade others to leave the company. Other singers advocated new companies that would compete with and ultimately ruin the NNOC. And Frederick Vida, remember him? I told you I'd talk about him in a moment. He was her first conductor, and unbeknownst to her, had worked diligently to align other men in an effort to instruct Mrs. Dawson in the finer points of running a company, and ultimately taking it over themselves. So he established the American Negro Opera Company in New York City in 1944, 1945, somewhere in that range. He was determined that they were going to do a professional production of La Traviata, compared to non-professional. Anyway. It wasn't financially successful, and they never did more than the one performance. So Dawson had the option of disbanding the company, settling the debts, and returning to teaching and conducting. This was not her plan, however. In addition to lobbying the union to get the company off the unfair list, She worked tirelessly to raise funds to erase their obligations. She returned to the recital stage herself, mostly at churches in Washington, New York, and Pittsburgh. She pivoted the company from opera to concerts, galas, talent shows, and beauty pageants. She began to focus more on the works of African American composers and turned to two composers with whom she had interacted regularly, Nathaniel Dett and Clarence Cameron White. Her first project was to adapt Dett's oratorio, The Ordering of Moses, into a semi-stage dramatic work that the members of the company performed throughout the Northeast. And you'll see articles in which it is stated that Ordering of Moses was performed in 1937 in New York and was interrupted, and that it was performed in the 1950s in New York and was interrupted, and that it wasn't performed in between. No, it was performed a lot, starting in the 1930s and going through the 1950s. It had long been in the repertory and had been performed by the choir in Pittsburgh. She now created a script to bridge the transitions between the original movements, crafting a presentation that would allow her to utilize not only soloists and choruses from the company, but costumes that were in the company's inventory in semi-dramatic concert performances. These took place primarily in churches, often as a fundraising effort, and you'll see some additional photos over on the display tables. It was also performed at one of the Washington festivals, and it was performed at Carnegie Hall in 1951, and that's the slide you see there. In the 1950s, she also made the decision to present Clarence Cameron White's opera Wanga. Written in 1932, it had been performed in Cleveland and in South Bend, Indiana, and would eventually be performed in Philadelphia by the Dramu Company. White had worked with librettist Frederick Matthias to create an opera based on the Haitian Revolution and on Dessalines, one of its first leaders. They conducted extensive on-site research to ensure the opera had a respectful and realistic voice. Madame Dawson apparently was drawn to this opera for a number of reasons. First, the cast was a manageable size and one that would make good use of the soloist and the chorus from the company. White himself was enthusiastic for a New York performance, which was Dawson's goal as well, and an opportunity to present an opera celebrating the first Black-ruled country in the Western Hemisphere. It was also meant to offset some of the more sensationalistic portrayals of Haitians and the religion of Voodoo that you saw in the popular press of the time. No zombies or anything like that. But all of this was irresistible to them. So, ultimately, the company performed the opera once on the stage of the Metropolitan Opera House in October of 1956. It was a straight rental deal, one entailing many restrictions imposed by the management. First, they could not use the services of house staff. They also could not use facilities such as the box office. As an outside company, they were not allowed to present a dramatized version of the opera, merely a concert version of the work. That was a hard and fast rule of the Metropolitan. As you can see there, she tended to skirt regulations just a little bit. Finally, much of the cost of the facility had to be paid up front, at least a week prior to the performance. As I said, Dawson skirted some of the provisions, costuming the company and stretching the definition of concert version. There were as many dramatic gestures and movements as she felt she could get away with, thus making the work semi-staged. It's the old better to ask forgiveness than permission. She didn't tell them about this up front, and that's exactly how she made some of these things possible. She worked tirelessly with her staff to accomplish the publicity, the box office operations, and backstage logistics. And when the production took place in 1956, it became the first time that an opera by a Black composer had been performed on that stage, and the first time it was rented to a Black company. It would be 65 years later, 2 years ago, or about a year and a half ago now, that the Metropolitan Opera would include a work by a Black composer in their season. So just a little bit of a difference there. Dawson also produced, oh, and by the way, at the left of that photo, you see Mary Cardwell Dawson, and next to her, Clarence Cameron White as part of the curtain call. They had everybody on stage at that point. Dawson also produced a series of yearly festivals. hang on a second, sorry. For the yearly festival, sorry, totally lost it there. There were 8 or 9 of them in all that neatly sidestepped the union restrictions. It allowed a variety-style production. She negotiated with Clark Griffiths for the use of Griffiths Stadium. His inclusion of players of color on his baseball team encouraged her to ask, and he agreed that the company could use the stadium for their performances free of charge. The facility allowed integrated seating, and you saw in the previous slide the crowd that was there. The festivals were highly varied and once more reflected Dawson's commitment to high standards. And I think I just went past all my stuff there. There we go. In addition to choirs from the opera company, solo performances, and opera scenes, she headlined recognized names. So you have people like Lucky Millinder and his orchestra. You have Noble Sissel. You have Blanche Calloway and her all-female jazz orchestra performing here. She lobbied everyone she could reach. You see a letter over on the display table to Pat Nixon in the late 1950s. She also lobbied Eleanor Roosevelt, and there's a wonderful photo from a meeting with her in 1955. She spoke at public meetings of churches and institutions like Howard University, and she lobbied the union to treat the company on an equal footing. I cannot state this enough. Her goal was not inclusion. She never lobbied Rudolph Bing of the Metropolitan Opera. She never lobbied Laszlo Halash of the New York City Opera, even though he was beginning to hire singers of color. And she didn't lobby the managers of any other white opera companies. Instead, she lobbied for equal recognition and consideration in venues, union treatment, and funding opportunities. Eventually, the company was able to mount infrequent productions in 49, 52, 54, and 56, the Wanga production. And she was almost always returned to the unfair list. Performers who had become active in opera and on Broadway in the 1950s performed with the company. This included Robert McFerrin, Muriel Ron, Carol Bryce, Napoleon Reed, Joseph Lipscomb, and Camilla Williams. During the 1950s, she continually lobbied arts organizations and political administrations for the support of singers and companies of color. She was appointed to an Arts Advisory Council by President John F. Kennedy, and worked to gain the recognition and support of the Ford Foundation. They didn't give her any money, but she did go ahead and submit an application for funding. She did all of this while suffering major health issues. In 1957, she had a major heart attack that sidelined her for quite a while. And then she suffered a fatal heart attack in 1962. It is indisputable that Madame Dawson exerted significant impact during her lifetime. Black singers were extremely active prior to the organization of the company. Singers such as Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, Ciceretta Jones, the Hyer Sisters, Katarina Yarborough, Jules Bledsoe, Lily Navanti, LaJulia Ray, Abby Mitchell, Todd Duncan, to name a few. Many others performed as they could, often with white companies in their off-season or with black companies such as those founded by Freeman and Drury. And the accomplishments of the company are numerous. Bringing the opera to the NAMM conference, providing artists like Lily Navanti, Menti Cato, Muriel Ron, and LaJulia Ray a stage where one had not existed regularly. Excuse me. Bringing a wider number of black musicians into the union and demanding recognition by that organization for artists of color. And by the time you get to the end of the 1940s, Muriel Ron was actually on the board of AGMA. Insistence on integrated audiences. The incorporation of works by African American composers in her repertory, bringing Ordering of Moses to Carnegie Hall in New York City in 1951, presenting Wanga on the stage of the Metropolitan Opera House in 1956, and bringing Black opera performance and composition into the conversation on a national level through her advocacy efforts. But perhaps more stunningly, and I want you to be very aware of this, during the run of the company, more than 1,800 individuals were involved with it over the course of 20 years. 1,800. Even with these accomplishments, her greatest impact has come in the years following her death, although her name was rarely known and the impact rarely acknowledged because people didn't know about her. People didn't know about her name. In 1955, the most obvious barrier was breached, at least symbolically, with the performances of Marian Anderson and Robert McFerrin at the Metropolitan Opera. We cannot consider this as equitable casting or colorblind auditions, but that's a topic for another paper. But we can note that African American singers were represented more on American stages during the 1950s than had been in the past. Singers such as Matawilda Dobbs, Carol Bryce, Camilla Williams, Robert McFerrin, Debria Brown, Leontine Price, Jesse Norman, William Warfield, Simon Estes, and George Shirley are all names with which we are familiar from the 1950s through the 1970s. And now we can look at achievements that would have been intensely gratifying to her. There are quite literally hundreds of singers in varying stages of their career on the regional and national levels. Since her death, there have been several African American opera companies that have been longer-lived and impactful. Opera Ebony, founded by Wayne Saunders and Benjamin Matthews. Opera South, a post-secondary program that included both white and black singers in the 1960s. And Opera Noir of New York, founded by Robert Mack, Kenneth Overton, and Baron Coleman, who have brought forward works by John Adams, Edward Boatner, remember I said he had an unpublished opera? Mark Fax, Scott Joplin, Virgil Thompson, and Clarence Cameron White. There are online organizations devoted to the promotion of Black singers and composers and who are instrumental in bringing these individuals to public attention. Black Opera Live, under the direction of Kenneth Overton, puts out weekly broadcasts and podcasts and collaborates on documentaries exploring race and inclusion in today's opera world. The Black Opera Research Network provides online resources and videos concerning not only African American representation in opera, but also highlighting opera performance and achievement in other parts of the world, particularly South America and South Africa. The Black Opera Alliance was formed to fight for equity in opera and comprises over 1,000 Black artists and administrators as members. Finally, there is the group Black Administrators in Opera. Today, we see more representation in these boardrooms and management offices of opera companies. Dr. Darrell Acton has served as Vice President of People Operations and Inclusion for the Philadelphia Opera, as well as being Artistic Director and Creative Producer for the New York-based Heartbeat Opera. Jennifer Bowman has been Director of Community and Learning for the Houston Opera. Michael Braxton has served as Director of Development for the Pittsburgh Opera. Courtney Clark has served as Director of Community Alliances for Arizona Opera and School Programs Manager for the Seattle Opera. Dr. Naomi Andre is Scholar in Residence for the Seattle Opera. Jessica Jan is a costume designer for the Lyric Opera of Chicago and for several European companies. Afton Battle is the Director of the Fort Worth Opera. Dr. Sharon Willis is the founder and director of AmeriColor Opera Alliance in Atlanta. Marcia Sells is now Chief Diversity Officer of the Metropolitan Opera. In addition to including Terence Blanchard's work last season, they now plan to incorporate works by Anthony Davis and others, and have included composers of color in their composer's studio. Opera St. Louis, among other companies, is committed to diversity and inclusion and has commissioned works for its seasons. And the Washington National Opera demonstrates this same commitment and includes performances such as this weekend's Passion of Mary Cardwell Dawson. Most immediately for us this weekend, and as she said, full disclosure, I'm on the foundation board. The Denise Graves Foundation is founded to provide mentorship, collaborative opportunities, and historical awareness for singers of color. We acknowledge the more than 2,000 singers of color since the mid-19th century. We acknowledge African American companies founded prior to 1950. And we intend to work with performers, arts organizations, and scholars to help address the tremendous gap we face in our histories of opera in this country and in the support of emerging artists. Ms. Graves' direct inspiration, as she will tell you very clearly, for founding this organization is the life and work of Mary Cardwell Dawson. I have glossed over many individuals in the course of this summary, and it's important to know that the work of supporting and empowering these artists is far from finished. But the work begun by singers in the 19th century, such as Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield and Ciceretta Jones, and continued by singers and impresarios such as Theodore Drury, Harry Lawrence Freeman, and Mary Cardwell Dawson, have led us to the point and allowed us to see that there is so much more that we will be achieving in the future. Thank you. And I think you would like to open it up for questions? We have a little bit? Gosh, I went longer than I meant to.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes for questions or so if anyone has a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Wait one second.
I'm sorry? The husband.
Can you tell us about her husband?
Okay, her husband. Walter, get back to the mic. After he was booted out of Pittsburgh, he went to work for the General Service Administration here in Washington. As a master electrician, he was put to cleaning out the ducts leading to the industrial fans. That was in 1942. He was still in that job in 1954 and had not been given any pay grade increases or any different assignments. In 1954, when Eisenhower issued the executive order to desegregate federal facilities, his broom closet locker room remained a broom closet locker room. He was not allowed into the main locker room, so he sued the federal government. His pro bono representative was Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., and he won. And so he was given back pay, he was given an upgrade in his position, he was given equity and assignments, and he was honored by the NAACP, I believe, in 1972, right about the time that he died. But it's an amazing story. And like I said, theirs was a story of so much mutual support because everything that he made, if it wasn't needed for their immediate living expenses, went directly into the company. Any other questions? Okay, we'll start up here and then we'll work back. How's that?
I was just wondering whether you feel that Mary Cardwell Dawson would have felt good about her life and what she'd managed to accomplish?
I think she would have felt good. I think she would have also felt frustrated. By the time the company, by 1956, with the Metropolitan having opened its doors, so many people looked at that and said, oh, we're here. You know, and particularly among the white audience members, they thought, well, they've got the opportunity now. And the focus shifted just a little bit so that it shifted more to inclusion rather than having the self-determining companies. So I think that might have been a little frustrating to her. Now, there were other questions over here. Hang on.
I'm wary of asking a downer of a question, but I've known Denise Graves for 20 years as a friend and colleague, and I didn't know this story. And as I sit here, I think this is what life is about. You learn. You constantly are learning. And yet, as you present this, this week in Florida, you have Governor DeSantis basically eliminating education programs like this. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about, as an academic, about how you forge ahead with stories, amazing stories like this, in the face of the Florida governor, the governor of Arkansas. How do you forge ahead?
Well, since you mentioned my previous state and my current state, that's okay. You keep going. You keep pushing, and you ignore it. You have to. My husband often said, I'm glad you're not teaching now, you get arrested. I said, I'd call the ACLU and say, do you have my back? Because I wouldn't put up with it. At least I say that, you know, it's easy to say that standing up here where I am now. But I think you have to keep pushing, and I think we have to go through organizations such as the Foundation, where we have an opportunity, and there are a number of, Harold and Blackwell has a foundation. There are several others. There's one that's dedicated to Katarina Yarborough. I think we use all of these resources at our disposal to engage in what we call public musicology, in bringing this information to the public, in bringing this awareness to the public, and having this educational program going to offset some of that. It's what we have to do. And now, I'm sorry, you were next. You've been waiting patiently.
It's okay. My question was about the performers that she had in her productions. You had mentioned some of them had trained in Europe. Were there any performers that specifically came back from work in the European presumably the European opera houses, to work specifically with her, or were motivated to come back because she did have this company and they realized they would have opportunities that didn't previously exist in the U.S.?
Not specifically. Lillian Avanti was already back. She had already returned to Washington in the 1920s. And so she took the opportunity, but she didn't come back specifically for that. And I don't know of any others that would have. Most of them stayed in opera houses in Europe, and there are several scholars now working on those histories. One's working on the history of Black performers in Germany. There are a couple working on some of the opera houses in Italy and France to put together that history, because that's part of the picture that we simply don't have. It's not complete for us at this point. Katerina Yarborough and Jules Bledsoe both went to Europe and worked there extensively, rather than staying in this country and continuing to fight all of this. Where Dawson really excelled was in recognizing talent. So for instance, Napoleon Reed that I mentioned had been a stockyard worker in Chicago, and she heard him sing at a church, sing a solo at a church, and she recruited him for the company. Joseph Lipscomb was an elevator operator in Pittsburgh, same thing. And plus, she worked with people who had been involved in music organizations, community groups, some of these opera companies, and brought together just an amazing array of talent and support so that anybody who wanted to be on the stage could be on the stage. She worked with, you'll see a picture, if you see the exhibit at the Kennedy Center, and I really urge you to see that picture, the creative team that put it together is here, and they've done an amazing job on it. But there's one photo of Aida in Pittsburgh, I think it was, and there are a bunch of little girls in pink tutus, and we have the costume there too. And it's like the juxtaposition of the pink tutus against the Aida costumes is kind of odd, but she was using one of the community ballet schools and giving them the opportunity to be on that stage. And so she worked tirelessly to get all of that done. She also taught piano, she taught organ, she taught Ahmad Jamal when he was about 7 years old, when he was still in Pittsburgh, that type of thing. She had a really amazing eye for spotting talent. Yes, sir.
Yes, could you tell us a little bit about the restoration of the National Negro Opera House in Pittsburgh and Denise Gray's dream of helping to restore this in honor of Mary Cardwell Dawson?
Well, the house in Pittsburgh is owned by Janae Solomon, and Janae is the one that's leading this effort. The house was, I don't know how many of you know anything about the house. She had been in a storefront on Franks Avenue in Homestead for the longest with her school. And in the early 1930s, it was around 1931, 1932, she moved to this house on Franks Avenue in Pittsburgh in the Homewood district. And it was this gorgeous old Victorian-looking house. It was owned by Woogie Harris, who was part of the ownership of the Homestead Grays. Do I have the right team? And he was also the local numbers runner. And on the first floor, you had a jazz club, a nightclub, and since some of this was during Prohibition, we won't talk about that. But during that time, and then particularly after Dawson left for Washington, it became a boarding house for those that were traveling to Pittsburgh who could not stay in the hotels. They didn't have hotel accommodation, so it became a boarding house. So you have people like Lena Horne, as late as Roberto Clemente, different people staying there. It was abandoned in about 1980 and eventually sold for taxes in around 2000. Was it just 2 years ago? Gosh, seems like so much longer. It was the National Historic Landmarks put it on their endangered places list, which then allowed Janae to begin gathering funds, and it is currently under restoration. Some of Denise's former students have sung in support of fundraisers and so forth, and that's how Denise learned about Mary Cardwell Dawson about 3 or 4 years ago. She had never heard of her. And and then we got together and she was going, okay, you're gonna work with me in the foundation. I was going, yes, ma'am. And So I don't have a lot of information beyond that. I know that the work has started, and I know that they are committed to, one, finding as many pieces and parts that have been taken out of the house as possible, and for the rest of it, restoring it. They have lots of photos of the interior so that they can restore it to where it looks like. And last I heard, the ultimate goal was to make it a community music center, particularly for opera. So that's what they're working toward. Oh, let's go with her, and then we'll go with you. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening.
Hi.
I had a question. Maybe you answered it earlier, but do you foresee this lecture and the exhibit moving to other areas or other parts of the nation?
I'm always available.
Okay.
Anybody want my, but anyway, seriously, this particular exhibit, probably not, but the exhibit that's at the Kennedy Center, that's our ultimate dream, is to have it to where it can be portable and we can take it to other opera houses, universities, educational institutions. That's part of what we're working on with the foundation, is identifying the best practices and best ways of beginning this educational process. And it's going to, if we have our way, it's going to be a national effort. And it's going to be K through 12, through post-secondary, through emerging artists.
Excellent.
So, yes, sir.
Oh, so part of this is an announcement. It's an ordering of Moses is going to be performed in Washington,
Right,
right, in early February.
correct.
Okay.
And it's
so-
being performed this weekend by Oberlin as well.
Oh, okay.
All right. That's
Great.
why some of our people couldn't be here. They're at Oberlin,
Oh, wow.
working with that.
So if anyone's interested, I'm sure you could just Google ordering of Moses in D.C. and
Correct.
talk about the upcoming performances. I was wondering, since it's going to be performed here, could you elaborate at all on the production that she did of Ordering of Moses?
Well, basically, and I've looked at the script, I have a copy of it, but getting ready for all of this, I just found it a few months ago and haven't really delved into it that much. In fact, I think you have a copy of it over there, or some of it? Do you? Some of this, a photograph of it. There's a typescript downstairs in the collection. And what it looks like she did was she took the spirituals and the arrangements and all that were part of the original oratorio, and then just wrote dialogue to basically tell the story of Moses and the leading of the children of Israel, and make it into a dramatic work. And like I said, she had some costumes that were part of her stock. She had bought some from some opera company that was failing. And then a lot of the costumes were made by members of the community, because if you look at the different pictures from different performances, all the costumes are different. So it's obviously been put together by members of the chorus or whatever. And we have some of them on display at the center as part of this exhibit. They are now housed at the Heinz Historical Center in Pittsburgh, and they are actively working to restore them and to conserve them. And so we chose some of the ones that were most complete and identifiable and colorful and striking, and they are in this. Actually, Tiffany did, I don't take credit.
We have time for about one more question or so, I think.
Thank you. I just wanted to introduce myself, Karen. Hello. My name is-
Janae,
Yes.
Okay,
My
good.
name is Janae Solomon. I
The
am
mask, it
restoring,
didn't do it.
yes, restoring the National Opera House in Pittsburgh. And thank you all for coming. I just really wanted to say that when I started restoring the house in 2000, and we Googled Mary Cardwell Dawson and the National Opera House and had these events, the result was zero. There was nothing out there. And it took 13 years to gather everything I'm seeing here today. So it's overwhelming that 23 years later, there's so much support for something that when I started, I was the lonely soldier. So Karen, thank you so much for uplifting the work. It's a national effort. And it's
We've been working on this a
definitely
long
not
time.
something that one person can do. So thank you all for supporting it, and thank you, Karen.
well, I mean, I hate to admit this because I'm dating myself, but I started working on this in '97. And the way that I came to it, I had never heard of Mary Cardwell Dawson. And I was finishing up my dissertation and decided that if I never heard the name Saverio Mercadante again, I could die a happy woman. That's another story. But anyway, I knew that, oh, sorry, you're going to get to see the whole slideshow there. I knew that I needed to do something in this country because I was getting into administration in 12-month appointments. And Wayne Shirley, who was a librarian here at the Library of Congress, helped put together a calendar. And I got the calendar because it had a picture of Florence Coppola and Robert Shaw in it. And they were heroes of mine. I turned the page, and there was the cast picture from Aida in 1941. And it talked about Clarence Cameron White's Wanga and so forth. So I started looking up Clarence Cameron White, going, oh, here's a composer I can work on. And every time I looked him up, they mentioned this Mary Cardwell Dawson in the National Negro Opera Company performing it at the Met in 1956. And so I said, okay, obviously there's something at the Library of Congress. My husband was coming up here on a business trip. I tagged along. I called. They said, oh, yeah, you can get to it. And I was thinking, a box or two. 67 boxes later of materials, and here we are. So it's been a long process, and Janae's been involved in it, and it's been a long fight. And that's why I said the last 4 years are just humbling in the way that it has taken off. And now the goal is to take this and move and begin to include all of these others that were left out of the narrative, because they need to be included as well. Someone over here had a quick question. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that,
What's up? So we can.
you mentioned that she found creative ways to try to work around union restrictions, and that your observation was the union restrictions were disproportionately
Right.
applied to her. Was there ever a break point where she sort of beat that down?
No, not really. There were a few points where she had strong reactions, like the hearing in 1944, and I have this from Barbara Edwards Lee, so it's anecdotal, but there were other witnesses, and I will not mention specific singers. But at the board meeting where they were having this hearing, when you read through the minutes of the board meeting, it says, at this point, Mrs. Dawson got upset and the meeting had to be stopped. Well, she got upset because one of the board members said, well, I don't understand why we're talking about this anyway. Everyone knows that Negroes can't sing grand opera. And she slugged him. And she was arrested. She was determined. I mean, she would not take no for an answer. But the union, powerful as it was, and I mean, this was what they were doing. They were protecting singers. And if you look at it from their side, they were protecting those singers who had not been paid. In their view, that was the bottom line. She had not met the basic agreement. But by putting additional restrictions, there was another point where they were making a waiver for a white company who had done much the same thing. And one of the board members said, well, what if Mrs. Dawson finds out about this? Oh, well, we're going to make sure she never finds out. So it was quite deliberate. You know, and that's one of my next projects, is to go through all of that and see what I can unearth. There are literally thousands of pages of transcript. I think I counted at one point about 12,000 pages. It'll take a while. So, well, thank you. Thank you for coming tonight. We appreciate you being here.